Welcome, viewers, to our Inside Interviews podcast, which is an enlightening series, we would hope, of academic discussions, taking a deeper dive on a variety of unique topics. After this episode, be sure to check us out on our website, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Today, we are honored and pleased to have the Associate Professor and Director of the Middle Eastern and North African Minor at Notre Dame University, Professor Hussein Ali Abdulsater. He completed his PhD at Yale University. His research focuses on Islamic intellectual history, particularly the development of theological schools, the formation of sectarian identities, and the various modes of rationalism as expressed in Islamic theology and Arabic literature. He has several publications. One of the most noteworthy ones is his book, Shi'i Doctrines, Mu'tazili Theology, al-Sharif, al-Murtada, and the Systemization of Imami Discourse, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2017. He also has a forthcoming book entitled The Theology of al-Jahiz, a Forgotten Islamic Rationalism, also coming with Edinburgh University Press. Thank you very much, Dr. Abdulsater, for joining us today. Let's begin, and we're going to focus this podcast or this discussion around your book on Sharif al-Murtada and Imami theology more generally. Usually we like to ask most of our guests on the show, how did you come to study this subject and the very technical texts that are involved in that regard?
Thank you so much for having me. So how I came to study those texts. Now, whether we are talking about the first book, the one on al-Sharif al-Murtada, or the second book, the one on al-Jahiz, you'll see that there is a certain common theme, which is both individuals are considered major figures in Arabic literature and also major figures in Kalam. So there is this kind of interest in looking at the body of Islamic knowledge, not only as a body of knowledge that is technically written for people interested only in religious studies, but also as a body of knowledge that is aimed at presenting a certain view of the world and blending it with the humanism that usually is implied in a literary device. So my interest in those people came primarily because I have a deep-seated interest in theology, and I'm very much someone who likes Arabic literature. So they both presented an excellent meeting point, and I would venture to say that there are few people in the whole of the classical Islamic tradition who can claim to be as significant as these two individuals in those two fields of knowledge production. So it was kind of natural, first, as a reflection of my interests. The other thing, of course, is the early schooling and upbringing. I grew up surrounded with these texts. So it also, it is probably a bias of availability, but I did find them available around me quite a lot and discussed quite a lot from different perspectives. So it is a context where, opportunity meets interest.
Wonderful. And they are, and even for Arabic speaking individuals, these are not easy texts. They are written in classical Arabic. They are nuanced. I myself have been, in the field for 20 plus years, reading, immersed in Mufid and Murtada and Tusi and Karajiki and the like, and Alamat al-Hilli. They're not easy. They're written, in a certain kind of prose sometimes, and it's remarkable. Just looking at the book, the amount of sources that you've referred to in your bibliography. It takes a certain level of aptitude as well and development to read these proficiently. Knowing Arabic alone is not sufficient to understand these texts, certainly. I would venture to say most Arabs or even someone who has a native proficiency of Arabic wouldn't necessarily understand these texts. So, if somebody wanted to study theology, early Islamic theology, what advice would you give them for developing an aptitude for understanding these texts? Because obviously modern standard Arabic will not be sufficient for doing that. Yeah.
I think modern standard Arabic will be more of a disservice in this context, because many of the terms have taken a different meaning over the centuries, and leading them back in those old texts will probably lead to a misunderstanding. Now, the advice I give, first, let me say that by theology, are we talking only about kalam or about the general world of religious thought, aside from, of course, fiqh and the legalistic tradition particularly? If we're talking about the general world of religious thought, then we will have to include hadith more or less.
Yeah.
But if we are thinking about a more systematic or constructive attempt at making sense of the world, then we will have to look at genres that are more or less beyond hadith. Whether they build on hadith or just avoid hadith is a different discussion, but they are beyond hadith. Now, my advice, and I will focus on kalam specifically here, my advice is try to free yourself as much as possible from the strongly negative stereotypes of what those theologians and their texts were meant to do and how they did it. There is a deep-seated bias against kalam and mutakallimin. This comes from a number of sources. The point is, when we go to study them, it will not be helpful for us to understand what this is about if we cannot free ourselves from that bias.
Yeah, thank you. And bringing us to biases and discussions about biases, the often recurring thesis in the Western Academy, and probably maybe even outside of that, is that 5th century Shi'ism is a product or a byproduct of Mu'tazili thought. Any undergraduate who studies Shi'ism will probably come across this in a textbook very often, as you know. You address that at the very beginning of your book, that there is a conceptual confusion going on here. You address it quite extensively, obviously, throughout the book. Care to address that question right at the outset, that Mu'tazili rational theology, that this whole notion of what is called rationalism and its development, especially in the late 4th, 5th century Hijra, so we're talking, 10th, 11th century of the Common Era, and its integration into Imami Shi'i thought that, is essentially not unique to Shi'ism. Shia's, scholars didn't do much except basically copy and paste Mu'tazili thinkers, which is a very obviously simplistic and reductionist approach. But as we do read that quite often, and it's often used also as a polemic. Why don't we begin with that and then go to Sharif Murtada? If you could just briefly address this idea of rationalism and the thesis that somehow Shi'ism began as this Gnostic, archaic, mystical, hadith-based tradition, which then transformed into a reason-based tradition when it comes to understanding God, understanding the prophets, and so forth. And this was not a product of Imami Shi'ism, but just simply a case of borrowing or copying or influence.
Well, this is a great question, and is a very central question to the whole debate, as you know. I'll try to be as brief as possible, because you touched on so many important points, and each one of them will need an extensive engagement if we want to give it due attention. But I'll try to be as brief as possible. it is true that you, as you said, that it is a polemic. It is used as a polemic. It's either a first-hand polemic. You find it in anti-Shia polemics in the traditional sources. Uh, Zahabi says that. Ibn Hajar says that. Ibn Taymiyyah before Zahabi said that. Even if you go back slightly, it is said as a claim, but not as a polemic. A claim with an implied polemic, yes, but not bluntly as one in earlier sources. And it is also a second-hand polemic, usually in modern day, citing Western authors who say this, but it is recycled as a polemic as well. But this time, instead of falling back on immediately the polemical tradition, you find a way to cite a Western author. Oh, more often than not, this Western author is wedded to that polemical tradition, especially the early 20th century authors who had access disproportionately to certain libraries and not to others. So this is basically an outcome of a number of factors. Some have to do with power, some have to do with geographic accessibility, some have to do with uh, proficiency in traditions and not in others. Okay, so yes, I do grant that it is used heavily in a polemical way. Now, the point for me is to see whether it is uh, in any way uh, an intellectually coherent claim or not. Whether it is good for polemic or not, I leave it to polemicists. You know. Now, if we look at how the claim is made, usually the claim is made to mean that Shi'ism in its earliest quote unquote more original form was, as you put it, Gnostic, hadith based, blah blah blah. And then later, around the 4th, 5th centuries of the Hijrah, it was transposed into a Mu'tazili matrix, so to speak, and now it's rational, and now it's from an answer that would respect how Shi'ism defines itself, we'll have to start from the premise that in that particular school of thought, regardless of whether we're talking about an early or a late phase, the ultimate authority is the Imam. It doesn't really matter from within that school of thought what all the people were saying during the time of the Imams, if it is not really what the Imam is saying. It doesn't matter from that angle whether Hisham ibn Hakam or Zurara or any of those people said anything, as long as it is not the Imam who is saying it. After the occultation, really, you will have to look at the scholars, because this is where we are looking. The point of this is you can easily assume that in the time of the Imams, really, what Shi'ism is about is what the Imams were saying. And then if it happens to be in the 4th century, which is effectively with the beginning of the occultation onward, it becomes something different, then we are saying that there is no claim that the authoritative Shia teachings in themselves have changed, because unless you can show that the Imams themselves during their time were saying the claims that are usually ascribed to that supposedly early phase of Shi'ism, then we are not looking at a change in Shi'ism itself. It is right, because the locus of authority is the Imams before 260 and the Ulama after 260 of the Hijri calendar. And this is where you have to show a change. At best, this is an argument from silence, or at least, or it is invoking the wrong kind of evidence. Because whatever the Ashab al-A'imma were saying during the life of the A'imma, this is not binding for the community. We know that because many of the highly respected Ashab of the A'imma were given very often corrective advice from the Imams. Right? So that's from within the categories of that discourse that believes the ultimate authority lies with the Imam. But if we take a step out and look at it from the standpoint of intellectual history, first, a number of people from the Ashab al-A'imma are known to have shared views that are usually associated with i'tizal. Right? Zurara was someone who believed in free will. And Zurara is someone who is in the first half of the second century of the Hijrah. He's very early to have to make the assumption that he was influenced by Mu'tazilism in a meaningful way, right? Uh, Hisham, if we have to trace his whatever is left from his sayings, Hisham actually was someone who was, if anything, more a person who shaped Mu'tazilism indirectly than the other way around. Van Es has roughly 200 pages on Hisham in his Encyclopedia of Islamic Theological Thinking of the first, second, and third century of the Hijrah. Van Es makes the claim very clearly that, if anything, Hisham was the one who influenced Nadam, and Nadam and Abu al-Hudayl were the people who shaped Mu'tazilism. Right? So the idea of Shi'ism going through a wholesale transformation is a bit difficult to substantiate. Now, another assumption that is usually implied in this is that there is one form of Shi'ism during the time of the Imams, and then it changed. But again, Shi'ism, although Twelvers, in particular Imamis before the 12th Imam, were not a huge community, numerically speaking, they were not insignificant in terms of numbers. If we want to believe Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari in Maqalat al-Islamiyyin, he's clear that this community is sizable. And second, they were very dispersed. You have one in Nishapur, a community in Nishapur. You have a large community in Qum. You have a large community in Baghdad and other parts of Iraq. And you have smaller communities far east, like far in the east. And you have communities like in Syria, Lebanon, this part of the Middle East. Especially before modern communication. And given that they were people who were more or less not favored by the government, it is normal to assume that they were developing different views. And individuals who are educated tend to have different intellectual sensibilities as well. So effectively, even during the times of the Imams, it makes sense to assume that there were people among the Shi'is who were more or less interested in rational theology and believing in it and promoting it. And there were people who were more or less interested in the esoteric side of things, or in stopping with authority and going like purely with the authority of the Imam and not asking too many questions as they see it. So what happens is maybe one of those trends became more powerful later or not, maybe. But it doesn't mean that there was one form of Shi'ism that was originally like true Shi'ism and then it changed. This is, in a way, ignoring the nature of the religious phenomena in such a dispersed community. It does not respect the textual evidence from individual theologians we have from the second century of the Hijrah. And it is not even consistent with how a Shia theologian working from within the same paradigm can come back at the claim. Which brings us to the polemical drive of that claim. It's effectively the point of influence. No one likes to be told that he is influenced. And a lot of it, a lot of the reaction has to do with the implications of the term. If you are influenced by another person, then your ideas maybe are not original, or you are not someone thinking for himself or herself, or your religious tradition is effectively borrowing or relying on some other religious tradition. This is also problematic because it's difficult in the history of a human thought to find an idea that is not in a way meaningfully related to ideas that were circulated in the same context. Now, it doesn't mean that it's influenced or not. Really, what we care about is the product of that intellectual exchange. What eventually ends up happening? You may be in a context where you come across an idea that you think is really nice. you bring it to your people, to the people with whom you are usually in conversation intellectually, and something totally new comes out of that. You know, the fact that you were influenced by that idea doesn't mean that the outcome really is a copy or lacks originality or even inferior in its ability to deal with the pertinent questions than the spark that started the conversation. So there's this kind of sense to the term influence. Harold Bloom has a book from the 70s, The Anxiety of Influence. It's about how people feel anxious about being influenced. In that context, it's about poetry, which also happens in Arabic poetry. This guy took that line from that guy, but then as Qadi al-Jurjani, the great literary critic in the Arabic tradition, will say, yes, but the line he gave us is way superior to the original line. So it is the same context in a way that we are looking at.
Yeah. And that, by the 4th and then going into the 5th century of the Hijra, of course, the Shia were living in a pluralistic society in terms of having various madhahib, both legal, various schools of thought, both legal and theological, in Baghdad, where they were living, which is the focus of your book here, or your 2017 book, that is, on Shi'i theology or Imami theology. And they were interacting with people, just like living in a modern university where different faculty members have even interact with different people and learn different things and attend different conferences. And it doesn't mean that they're just wholesale copying, but they're a part of a broader intellectual discourse. So tell us a little bit about what the life of Sharif al-Murtada looked like. Who was he? Just very briefly, and walk us through a day of his life, of what may have life, his intellectual or even social life look like. You do discuss it in the book, but I'd like the listeners to maybe be able to imagine, what it may have been like for them. I mean, today we live in these we work in these modern universities or schools, or madrasas or wherever people are. But what was it like at that time?
So he was born in 355 of the Hijri calendar to a very prestigious, wealthy, influential, and prominent family. His father was the head, or Naqib, basically the head of the descendants of the Abi Talib, Naqib al-Talibiyin. His mother was a descendant of the Nasr al-Kabir, the great Imam of Zaydi Shiites in Tabaristan. So he is descended from the 7th Imam Musa al-Qadim in the Imami reckoning on his father's side, and Nasr al-Kabir, the great Zaydi Imam, on his mother's side. So this is already a life of extreme privilege. Probably the only person more privileged in Baghdad at the time was the Abbasid Caliph himself.
Wow. Okay.
So he has this double kind of connection to both groups in terms of power and genealogy. He is also born 20 years after the Buyids have taken Baghdad. So he is born in a context where the people in power were Shi'is. And whether you want to think of the Buyids as Zaydis or Imamis is good for him because of his particular positioning. And he is the eldest son, right? So Sharif al-Radi is 5 years younger. So this is a man, or a young man originally, or even a teenager, whose tutors were the likes of Ibn Jinni, al-Marzubani, Rumani, the greatest names in Arabic literature, not only of the time, but probably of all times. Okay? Mm-hmm. And these were his tutors, literally, they tutored him at home. Uh, and then, of course, on the religious side, he was studying with Sheikh al-Mufid mostly. That's his main influence on the religious side. And with the mutakallimun, most of them are Mu'tazilis, by the way. We don't know much about his religious schooling, let's say, in fiqh. He studied with the major fuqaha in Baghdad, and like he has notes where he said, "Look, I asked him this, he answered me that." But but basically, Sharif al-Murtada is someone who grew up with basically having the most important university come to his home instead of him going to it.
Almost like royalty.
Yeah, not almost effectively, his mother is really royalty.
Yeah.
And his father is Naqib al-Talibiyin. When the Buyids and the Hamdanids went to war, it's his father who brokered the peace.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was, if we take the word of al-Khansari in Lawdat al-Jannat, or Abdullah al-Afandi al-Asfahani in Riyad al-Ulama, he was the wealthiest Imami scholar of all time before the Safavid times.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have the status coming from lineage, you have prominence, you have wealth, you have all of this coming to him. So much so that before he turns 30, around the time he turns 30, even in the life of Sheikh al-Mufid, you have letters addressed to him as if he is the head of the community from distant and far corners of the empire, right? And this is definitely owing to his family connections. So this is the kind of life he had in the first half, so to speak. Now, because he was more interested in knowledge than in politics, after their father died, actually, Sharif al-Radi became the Naqib al-Talibiyin, not Sharif al-Murtada. Although Sharif al-Murtada, being the eldest son, is the one who did the funeral prayers and these things. But then Sharif al-Radi didn't live long. He dies age 45. And then all these positions fall to al-Murtada after that. So for the last 30 years of his life, he was the head of the Imami community. He was the head of the Naqib al-Talibiyin. He was the Naqib al-Talibiyin. He was in charge of the Department of Grievances, Diwan al-Madhalim. In addition to having his own library that he actually made accessible publicly, and he was known to pay a decent and generous stipend to his students and provide them as well with stationery. So we are talking here about a person whose life is not typical of an Imami scholar before or after.
Yeah.
Maybe one single detail that can highlight his importance is when the Buyids and the Abbasids, the king and the caliph, had a certain kind of conflict, al-Murtada was the person who took the oath from the Buyid king that he will not harm the Abbasid caliph in public. So both kind of entrusted him with adjudicating that dispute. And sometimes the Buyid king, when the soldiers would rebel and like when there's a mutiny in Baghdad, the Buyid king personally with his family hid in al-Murtada's house.
Wow.
So
I did not know that. Okay.
Yeah. So we are talking about that kind of status.
Which brings me to something else that I'm thinking about here, which is the occultation has occurred, right? We're now almost 200 years, well, 150 years into the occultation or so. And the Shia ulama are not just bookworms. They are more than this. They are much more than what seemed to me from what you're saying. Their function is much vaster than simply being expositors of religious literature. They are important, at least in the case of Sharif Murtada, social figures in the society. They are conducting and performing important exercises in what may be known as civil society of that time, so to speak. I mean, it may be anachronistic to use the word, but just so people can kind of understand what life is like there. Despite the fact that these would normally be duties that would fall to the imam or to the one that is appointed by the imam in some way, and they've kind of taken on this mantle of being the shepherds of the community, and not only shepherds of the community, if I'm understanding this correctly, but liaisons between the community and the outside world, or those that lie outside of the Imami domain, which would be either Sunni or Zaydi or politicians or so on and so forth. How was this something that just kind of naturally al-Murtada took on, or was this something that had to be negotiated and debated, and they had to kind of figure out, wait a second, what do we do? Can we really step into this role? Do we not step into this role? Where do we stand? Or was it something that he just kind of, it was assumed that, well, we're going to kind of take on this mantle of Naqib Talibin, mathalan, or head of the office of grievances, of Madalim. These are social roles that have tie-in to politics as well, in a way, right?
I think it is both something that came naturally to him and something that had to be negotiated and defined over time. Now, let me just take a step back. During that time, especially in a place like Baghdad, especially in such a place, of course, there were quarters that were known for being mostly, like dominated by the Hanabila or by the Imamiyya. There were that thing. There used to be such a thing. Probably still is in most of the Middle East in different towns. But the boundaries were not, especially on the level of scholars, the boundaries were very much fluid, especially if you're talking about someone like al-Murtada. I think a good instance can clarify this. The Masjid Buratha, which still stands in Baghdad now.
Yes.
Masjid Buratha.
I just drove by it during Christmas with my family. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Masjid Buratha was the site of a lot of sectarian contestation historically. We'll not get into the details because it's not the important part. But the important part is the following. A few times, the sectarian strife around Masjid Buratha forced someone like Sheikh al-Mufid to leave Baghdad. And the Buyids actually, though being sympathetic to Shi'ism, did ask him to leave. To quell, the sectarian fire and whatever. But during the same episodes, it was almost always Sharif al-Murtada will be the one talking to the Buyid king and the caliph, the one negotiating an end to these hostilities, and the one who actually goes to the caliph and convinces him that Masjid Buratha must be reopened for prayer. The difference in what's happening to Sheikh al-Mufid and Sayyid al-Murtada, although al-Murtada is a much younger person, also tells us why it is naturally something that fell to him and not to others. Of course, social class and status played a major role here. The reason why, even in the later historiographical tradition and bio-bibliographical tradition, you will see that al-Murtada is treated a bit more nicely than Sheikh al-Mufid is by non-Imami biographers. And the difference has nothing to do if you want to talk about theology. These two people are not different theologically when it comes to the matters that would cause a certain reaction when it comes to sectarian issues. The main difference is that al-Murtada was always presented as effectively a statesman, in addition to being an Imami scholar. His uh, his solid connection not only to the Buyids but also to the Abbasids, and his poetry, by the way, he was a poet. He has a relatively large diwan. His poetry is very kind to the Abbasids. He praises them, you know. Unlike Sharif al-Radi, who had good days and bad days with them, you know. So I think it fell to him naturally because of his status, because of his temperament, apparently. He was able to usually be a broker between conflicting parties in Baghdad and around Baghdad. And also because of the fact that his house usually hosted a lot of debate sessions from different schools of thought among Muslims and non-Muslims. This must have also made him a more natural candidate to speak on behalf of the Imami community.
Yeah. It almost seems very eclectic in a way, that he had these eclectic interests. He was very, he understood the social norms of society. He understood what we would say, kind of the taqalid of that society, the customs, and he was very adept at negotiating those various complexities. And I think this is just very fascinating, and we'll move on a little bit more to the theology of things. But I think the social history is often overlooked. Actually, I think sometimes we focus so much on the nitty gritties of the theological writing, and we don't really understand the person behind it. So I think this discussion, I think people, at least I find it really interesting, bringing us to some of the essential elements of which is really the oneness of God, the prophethood, and Imama, and of course justice. We're not going to go through all of these things, but can you kind of, in a nutshell, tell us what was his contribution in this regard to the Imami school of thought, and how formative or impactful was it? I know this is a broad question, so maybe you can just choose one or two very simple examples. Don't have to give a whole kind of thing, but just so that the listeners, I think, and myself can kind of get a kind of concrete example, like this is what he did, this is how he's contributed to the shaping of Imami 12 or Shi'i, belief, or the belief system.
As you noted, it's a very broad question.
Yeah.
I've spent a few years
You could
of my
choose
life
something from
working on it.
Tawheed, from Nabuwa, from Imama, maybe anything.
Of course, it's very befitting if it's about an Imami community to choose Imama.
Imama, yes, let's go with Imama.
But it's not going to be only that. But yes,
Yeah.
we
Okay.
cannot omit that part.
Yeah.
We will have also to relate it to the social history of the matters.
Okay.
Before I say a few words on exactly how I think he shaped the belief system / the identity, in as much as you can separate these two. The thought experiment I invite people to do is, if the same ideas were presented by a marginal person, the same arguments, the same ideas were written by someone who is of no status, or who lives in a distant town far from the political center, would they have done the same? Would they have had the same effect on the belief system? This is something I leave to everyone to think for themselves. Okay? So that's important, because as you just said, social history is significant, and it's not only significant because it makes for a juicy gossip about daily life. No, most of the ideas can in a way be related the concrete realities of power and influence and connections. Uh, we just said something about how Shiism is presented in many of the early in Western academia, and the same applies there as well, of course. So, if you are living in Baghdad at the time, you are in a unique position in a way as a historical moment, let alone his own positionality. You have the first time when the Imami community is enjoying sympathy of the government. Second, you are in a place where not only the government is sympathetic, but also the population has uh, uh, we don't know exactly the percentages, but you can venture um, to say that in Baghdad, at least, the Imamis were at least a very sizable minority. So you have a sympathetic government, you have a sizable minority, you have uh, the absence of the Imam, which means the Imamis are not seen as politically dangerous to the authorities. Although Van Es has this very nice line that the Imamis have always been theoretically radical and politically quietist. But that's a different, as opposed to the Zaydis who were the other way around.
Yeah.
But then, so the Imamis are not politically dangerous for the authorities at the time. And you have this moment where you are in the process of uh, uh, looking at an Imami elite, regardless of its allegiances intellectually, but it is solidly established in Baghdad from the end of the 3rd century of the Hijrah. So even 50 years before the Buyids came, the Wazir was Ismail ibn Bulbul, who was like, if not an Imami, then more on the side of Mukhammisa and Mufawwida, but he was definitely solidly in that camp. You had Ibn Rawh, the 3rd Safir, according to the Imami view of the Ghaiba. Ibn Rawh was a very close, was a friend of the Khalifa himself, of al-Radi, and he would attend court always. So you had the al-Furat, a very powerful family of Wuzara and Kuttab and Shi'is. This is before the Buyids came. So we are looking here at a moment, if you are living at that time in Baghdad, where the different trends within the Imami community has to be reconciled or defined or what have you. And at the same time, you don't have to look over your shoulder for government persecution all the time and be concerned with that. So what al-Murtada did is effectively continue the work that had started at the turn of the century or with the beginning of the Ghaiba. Unfortunately, we have a very painful gap regarding the development of Imami theology in the very first generation after the Ghaiba. We don't
From Khomeini going forward, you mean?
Yes, especially with theology.
Yeah.
We have a few names, but we barely have any texts. So you know that al-Jahiz al-Khurasani was very respected and very influential. But we have a couple of debates that he was party to, but we don't have the text by him.
Yeah.
And his position is not very clearly presented. And it is actually a polemical context. Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi wants him to say something, you know. But this is someone who was a teacher of Sheikh al-Mufid. So my point is, work had started. We cannot look at the violent confrontation between Ibn Rawh and al-Shilmaghani without thinking about defining the community as well. What is acceptable and what's not. Sheikh al-Saduq himself far for an Arab, it will be far in qum, depends on how you see yourself. But then Sheikh Saduq himself is writing اعتقادات الإمامية. Now, when you write that book, you are clearly engaged in a very deliberate act of community defining.
Setting boundaries. Yeah.
اعتقادات الإمامية. Why would you title your book that way?
Yeah.
If it is not in your mind,
Having
right?
doctrines. Yeah.
Of course, because clearly people did not have a clear idea what the Imamis had. Of course, partly because probably we had so many different opinions claiming to be representing the Imami view. Right? الشيخ المفيد, in addition to تصحيح اعتقادات الإمامية, which also tells you something about what was happening regarding the self-image of the community and its identity, belief system. If you look at أوائل المقالات, which doesn't receive nearly as much attention as it should as a book, in the very beginning of أوائل المقالات, and the أوائل المقالات was probably written in response to a request by Sharif al-Radi. And the very beginning of the book, he says, you have asked me to write a book that shows the difference and the distinction between Shia and Mu'tazila. Which is that some people were thinking, oh, what's the difference between these two? And among other things, right?
Yeah, and in that book, he addresses things like, can the imams hear people's voices when they visit them? I mean, so clearly these were some issues that he wanted to say, well, others don't believe this, but we believe kafatan that they can hear us, for example, right? I mean, just giving an example because my
yes.
work on data, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because your dissertation, yes,
Yeah.
you're just, yeah. So clearly there is a need to define this community, an identity and a belief system. And this is where Sharif al-Murtada's theoretical contribution becomes particularly important due to his social status. So take his work on Imama. Now, first, he is responding to Abdul Jabbar, So you start from a very, very high place. He's responding to someone who was believed to be the major theologian of the Mu'tazilis. Abdul Jabbar is much older, but he lived a long life. So when Sharif al-Murtada is responding to Abdul Jabbar is in his prime. Murtada is in his early 30s.
So he wrote al-Shafi fil Imama, which is somewhat an engagement with Abdul Jabbar when he was in his earlier part of his career.
Yes. The Shafi was finished in the 380s.
Got it. Okay.
And it is an answer to the last two volumes of Al-Mughni, right? But here you see that maybe because he was young at the time, and you take on a big shot, so you want to. You see that he is aware that there is a problem with how others perceive Imami beliefs. He complains page after page that what you ascribe to us is not what we really believe in. But then you clearly see the boundaries of identities being drawn. That point, this is not us. This is a group that we renounce. This is, a group that claim to be part of our community, but they are really not.
Yeah.
So with the Imama, Sayyid al-Murtada is trying to craft a theory that is first based on previous generations of Imami scholars, but more importantly, doing two things: engaging with history, the historical writings of the time, to an unprecedented level. Sometimes you feel yourself you are looking at those political pundits who are, like coming through all these political archives and finding statements to prove or disprove a claim. And two, he is showing Abdul Jabbar, and of course, it's not an audience of one, but since he is responding to him, that the basic building blocks of the most, at the time, cutting edge Mu'tazili theology makes way more sense in light of the Imami belief in the Imam. So that's what we were talking about earlier today.
Yeah.
When you get an idea there and you think, well, this idea makes much more sense in this context, not in that context. And this is what al-Murtada is really doing with the concept of the Imama. So the Mu'tazilis, especially Abdul Jabbar's understanding of how that theology works, for them, God is required to provide maximum lutf, divine assistance, to make sure that every mukallaf, that every morally responsible human being will have the best possible opportunity for salvation as long as his will is left free and uncompromised. That's the core of that theory.
Yes.
Sayyid al-Murtada comes and says, sure, would having a perfect human being on top of any society be more helpful or not towards that purpose? If yes, then you have to assume that this is a necessity, because the first assumption was God is required to maximize, not only to provide. So the moment you say that having such a person on top of the political system helps, then that assumption becomes a must, not a recommendation, it's a requirement. So he takes it that step further, and there was later in the Imami tradition, there's no going back.
From Qaidat al-Lutf.
From Qaidat al-Lutf, exactly the way al-Murtada, adjusted the original Mu'tazili claim and showed that actually that claim is more consistent within an Imami framework.
The Imami.
Yeah. So that's
does Murtada try to sorry, Professor, does Murtada try to say that, okay, while the Mu'tazila such as Abdul Jabbar were using this concept, does Murtada try to draw from the Imami tradition meaning from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, to support this qaida? Or does he just say, this is a rational premise that fits with our conception of the Imama? Does he import this mustalah into Imami thought from outside, in a sense? Like it's interesting, it fits well, it's logical, it's not mukhalif or in a state of khilaf to Imami thought? Or is it something that he also tries to draw from the Quran and the sayings of the Imams, of the Prophet and Imams?
No, this is also an excellent question, but it will open so many doors because let's say this particular discussion, al-Murtada starts it actually with Jahili poetry. لا يصلح الناس فوضى لا سرات لهم ولا سرات إذا جهالهم سادوا. And then he quotes al-Bashir. And then he goes to the Quran.
Yeah.
And then, so the idea there is, it is a universal, for him, a universal human conviction. If you have good people in command, people who are their subjects will be motivated to be better. No? Now, the interesting thing is exactly what you mentioned, how he relates it to the Imami tradition. Now, there are two ways to look at it. One of them is to think that if you can appeal to something that is so universally shared and accepted, then why appeal to something that is less universally shared and accepted? If the three of us agree on X, why should I appeal to Y on which only two of us agree? So even from a discursive standpoint, he doesn't have to connect it to that. It doesn't mean it existed or not. It means that from a purely, if you are an author, this is the wiser choice to make.
Yeah.
Especially if your interlocutor does not accept that other authority to which you could have appealed if you were speaking within your community.
Got it.
So this is also, I think, part why many people they come to those texts expecting, certificates of authenticity of a certain type to appear. Otherwise, it doesn't. Uh, when you look at another
يعني
genre,
بعد يصير مو من أهل البيت. It's not from
yeah,
أهل من جيبه. It's not from
exactly,
أهل, from his pocket.
yeah, it is a strange situation. I mean, also you have the difference in genres. He is here debating with a Mu'tazili theologian. Let's look if he takes a different track answering an istifta from within the community. When
Okay.
he is answering istifta'at from within the community, he is more likely to invoke hadith.
Yeah, we see that in Kitab al-Intisar. We see that in so many
He is more likely to invoke hadith or to invoke it implicitly. He would say, and we have hadith to that effect, but he doesn't quote it. Uh, on the other hand, Sheikh al-Mufid is way more comfortable stuffing his work with a hadith.
Yes. Kitab al-Irshad, look at that, and
Yeah.
others. Yeah.
So this is also partly related to their social status or to their audience that they have in mind, their interlocutors. If you look at Al-Amali, which is a great book.
Yeah, غرور الفوائد, yeah.
Yeah. Al-Amali are sessions or, debate sessions or dictations, translated the way you want, that he had at home. And you clearly get the sense that this is a man who had a weekly session open to each and every group of people, religiously speaking, in terms of their affiliation. So there is no need to invoke hadith there, hadith from the Imams, right? Although many times the hadith will appear in the context of a comment of a hadith from the Prophet or a tafsir of an ayah. It doesn't mean that Sharif al-Murtada did not care about Imami hadith. It clearly means that this is not a context where it would have made a difference for the argument. If he is objecting to Ibn Qutayba's understanding of a hadith about the Quran would not be لو كان هذا القرآن في إيهاب لما مسته النار. He's saying Ibn Qutayba did not understand the Arabic here. It's a metaphor. Why would he go and quote hadith from Nas? And sometimes he quotes it. And here also the nature of the social and the power context, especially later in the Arab world, will affect what we're seeing. The best edition of Al-Amali by far is the one edited by Muhammad Abu Fadl Ibrahim in Cairo. A few times, al-Murtada is quoting Muhammad ibn Ali. By that, he means Imam al-Jawad.
Oh, very good. Okay.
Muhammad Abu Fadl Ibrahim takes it to be Imam al-Baqir.
No.
Why? Because the Imam al-Baqir is one of the Tabi'un.
Yeah.
So he will be quoted as an early authority within that framework. But really, al-Murtada is quoting Imam al-Jawad, as we can tell from our books of hadith.
Yeah.
So this also affects how you.
It shows he was well aware of the Imami, of the narrations. He was aware of them.
Yeah, of course. Well, he studied them. He studied hadith with the brother of Sheikh Saduq. Now, clearly, he didn't have a high opinion of the Imami Muhaddithun.
Yeah.
And he expresses himself in a rather strong language a few times in the Rasail, to a point where he says the only Qummi of the previous generation who was basically acceptable to me is Sheikh Saduq.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is also this assumption that his awareness of hadith does not necessarily translate into him treating it in a certain way. And this is also something we need to keep in mind. Again, from a distance, people like to think that the great scholars are all in agreement, or they all kind of. But someone like you who spent time in the company of great scholars will know that it's not always the case.
بالعكس.
So even at this long distance chronologically, we can still see in the text that al-Murtada didn't have very high opinion of the muhaddithun. In the Rasail, he speaks about أصحاب الحديث المنتمين إلى أصحابنا.
Yeah.
Like he's not comfortable counting them solidly among the Imamis on theological grounds. He is thinking about free will and anthropomorphism.
Yeah. Because again, those were the issues that dominated his day, right? I think the important point that you've brought up, and we're coming towards the end here, which is we need to center his life and understand the historical, social context in which he was living, the people he was interacting with, the questions that he was answering, and the most important burning issues of the day that he was trying to answer. He still saw himself as a defender, a proponent, and a representative of 12er Imami Shi'ism. But the method that he took to assert those beliefs, to belief in the 12th Imam, the belief in the succession to the Prophet, so on and so forth, the belief in human free will, or at least a degree of it, he took a different route, clearly, in how he went about in doing that. But one of the things that I noticed that is a common thread, whether it be from Kulaini to Murtada or Fadl ibn Sha'ban, and so on and so forth, is they all believed in the invalidity of this concept of these rightly guided caliphs. There's only one rightly guided one, and that was Ali ibn Abi Talib. I mean, Sharif Murtada writes in a very explicit language in al-Shafi from the Imam. I mean, I wanted to ask you this question. I mean, because the way he writes and the way Mufid writes about this issue, I mean, clearly today it would be problematic to write this way. In the Middle East, their fires would be set. There would be very problematic, like the way they wrote about these issues. مع كل الصراحة they would speak very clearly about their opinion about the first three caliphs, what they thought about them in terms of their religious validity. I mean, even in Kitab al-Intisar, Sharif Murtada in Bab al-Qadha, in the section on Qadha, opines that on the question of whether they were even Muslim or not to begin with. I mean, he goes to that. I mean, I guess the question that I have for you is, they were interacting with non-Shia, obviously. But on the other hand, in their works, when they were engaging with them, or in other works, they were very clear about their Imami ideas in this regard that would not distinguish them very much from earlier authorities or earlier generations in terms of how they viewed, at least, I mean, I may be right, I may be wrong. You're more of an expert on this area than me, in terms of how they viewed themselves as a group vis-a-vis others.
I mean, of course, as a side note, I don't think you will need much reason to set fire in the Middle East, whether you say something or not.
Okay.
But
in those days, they were still writing in a very, at least, I mean, we know Mufid clearly in his work, Kitab al-Jamal and Sahih al-Imama. I mean, the way he writes very openly, Sharif Murtada and Shafi for the Imama and Kitab al-Intisar and many other places.
I think there are a number of things going on with that particular debate. First, let me just talk about both are important points, but one of them I think will be shorter to address. To think about the belief status of someone was not charged with what later tradition has given it. يعني when people read that Abu Ali al-Jubba'i and Abu Hashim كفر أباه أبا علي, it doesn't mean what people now take it to mean. It only meant that this theoretical given is inconsistent with holding sound belief. That's what they meant. They did not go into, well, does it mean a person is really a non-Muslim, or it meant that if you believe in X, then this X contradicts something at the very beginning of the alphabet. So you cannot believe this if you want to be a good. It
Yeah.
has a lot of the, uh, especially among certain type of mutakallimun, of which al-Murtada was one. It has, and I don't want to be glib about it, but it has feel of when certain ideologues nowadays jump on a statement by one figure and call him an enemy of the people.
Yeah.
It doesn't go that far,
Yeah.
but it is kind of a common rhetorical device, you know, because it leads to X, Y, and Z. The X, Y, and Z are things that never crossed the mind of the speaker. So, so this is an
Yeah.
important sideline about dealing with those texts. It's not like Abu Hashim and Abu Ali Jubba'i really pronounced each other kuffar, but you know how it goes. Now, the other point, which I think is more sensitive, part of, I think Muslims historically, by and large, were aware of the problem of the early historical memory. They were aware, all of them, of how painful it is. Whether you are a Shia Muslim or a Sunni Muslim, no one is happy to remember what happened after the Prophet. Your pain may come from what you believe to be should have happened immediately after he died, or from what you believe should have happened immediately after any of the first three caliphs died. But eventually, whether you are thinking about the fitna, about the Prophet's companions fighting and killing each other, or about what you think is an illegitimate form of power structure, none of this is pleasant for anyone to remember.
Yeah.
Muslims historically were aware of that. There were always the hotheads and the people who were enjoying saying things in a particularly provocative way, and the people who were more uh,
Nuanced.
cold and quiet about it. If you compare the language of Sayyid al-Murtada with the language of other Imamis, you will see clearly that while he doesn't concede an inch, he clearly doesn't think that the first three caliphs were legitimate. But he doesn't at all say anything disrespectful about them as individuals.
No, never. I've never seen it at least. Yeah, right.
So this is something that was eventually lost because of hypersensitivity and less refinement, depending on you are talking about the the sender or the recipient,
Yeah.
But so yes, it's not a secret that they did not believe that the first three caliphs were legitimate. But at the same time, there's a certain element of respect in how a person should address himself. Exactly because I know that the other Muslim highly respects and likes
And
this
they're living in
individual.
a pluralistic environment.
And you are living in a pluralistic environment. You don't expect people in the modern Western context, to come and believe that the Prophet was God's messenger, blah blah blah, if they are not Muslim. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that anyone should take it lightly to bring their objections that they get from the books of Sirah as they tend to a Muslim in a provocative way, unsolicited.
Yeah.
This takes us back, in my opinion, to the question of social status. It highly correlates with the fact that he was a son of privilege, who was surrounded by Abbasid cousins, Zaidi grandparents, and Imami parents.
Yeah.
Being a son of privilege, for Murtada at least, meant that there's a certain code that had to be observed. It doesn't have to come from privilege, but privilege does necessarily push in that direction. And you see it in the way he expressed himself. Even in al-Shafi fil Imama, he addresses the view that some people believe that Abbas, the Prophet's uncle, should have been his successor. Now, he clearly doesn't have any space for that in his theology,
Yeah.
but he dismisses it in a very respectful way if you are the Abbasid caliph reading what, this is
Yeah.
being written under your nose. You know, I think part of it has to do with respect. Uh, Now, of course, since you mentioned the al-Mufid wal-Murtada al-Tusi in that particular debate, Tahdhib al-Shafi is less diplomatic.
Oh yes, Talkhis al-Shafi of Sheikh.
Talkhis al-Shafi. When he takes Shafi, a lot of what he does is rearrange it thematically because it is now a book and not only a rejoinder. So the
Yeah.
argument, he rearranges it to be more systematic and not driven by what Abdul Jabbar had been saying. But
Yeah.
as he does that, many of the good expressions that Murtada actually did use in reference to certain people, they
Are
are
dropped.
dropped. Uh, so there is this element.
And could that perhaps be the reflection of what of Tusi was living at a time which was more embattled, in which the Imami community was facing a lot more violence, or at least towards the end of his career. I mean, I don't know. I'm just opining here that he was a little bit more sharp with his pen, so to speak, than Murtada, because they were from very different backgrounds as well in
They
their
were
life.
different
I don't
and
know.
different and
Maybe.
different and different circumstances as you know.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe if someone burns your library and forces you out of your
Oh
house,
yeah.
you will not be very kind.
Yeah.
But so Sheikh Tusi went through that. Murtada didn't have to really in a serious way. I mean, every time this happened to him, the Caliph himself would send the army to, it's very different in his case.
Very different.
So there is this one. There's also the context. There's the question of background. Sheikh Tusi, interestingly, is the one who started as a non-imam in his life. You know,
Yeah.
which is a very interesting thing as well, to keep in
Yeah.
mind. Now, he doesn't add anything that is in itself negative. He just
Yeah.
drops some of the more diplomatic turns of phrase
Yeah.
in Murtada's writing. Sheikh al-Mufid, you clearly got the sense that he was more in touch with popular sentiment.
Yeah.
I mean, starting from where he lived to his social background to his time. Sheikh al-Mufid, definitely part of his career was catering to people in a direct way.
Hence Kitab al-Irshad.
Exactly, hence way
Kitab al-Jamal.
more invocation of a hadith,
Yeah.
and then and
Kitab
hence
al-Mazar. He wrote a Mazar.
exactly. So this comes with more popular,
Yeah.
uh, interaction with the people. He didn't have any status with the government.
Oh,
Uh,
that's a big difference between the two.
exactly.
Very.
So you
And
see,
Tusi didn't have nearly the clout that that
no, of
not
course,
nearly,
yes,
right?
and he didn't have that clout, and for the last decade of his life, the Buyids no longer were there. It was the Seljuks, right?
Yeah.
So it's the element of power is there. I think someone like Murtada would, again, without conceding an inch, but the language is different.
Yes.
Remember, you have long mada'ih of the Abbasid Caliph in
Yes.
his diwan.
Yeah.
You will not find that.
Praising the
Yeah.
Abbasid Khalifa. Yeah.
So we keep
Well,
this
after
in
all, they
mind.
were his patrons. I mean, he had to. I mean, it was something of this was again, and we'll wrap up here. But the amazing thing that I'm taking away from this conversation, amongst so many such interesting things, is Sharif al-Murtada lived a life where he understood, it would seem, the necessities of his time. He understood how to navigate the social and political complexities of his age, and what he needed to do in order to continue his work, to support the Imami community, and be a part of what was Islamic civilization at that time. And that meant interacting with the caliphs, it meant interacting with people different from his ideas. And a part of that was also being that in that position of privilege, which he inherited from both sides, so on and so forth, um, which is quite remarkable. Do I have it right in some way?
Of course, of course.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
only thing I would like to add here is I do believe that his discourse in talking and discussing with other Muslims is something that is pretty much needed. Uh, I think part of the tragedy that befalls much of the Muslim world now is that uh, people have either lost or seem to have lost uh, the understanding of how much respect
yeah,
is needed when people disagree with each other. Uh, it doesn't have to be either conformity or name calling. Uh, you know, uh, his style of writing is not only, I think, a strategic choice, but it's also a reflection of what a good scholarly character ought to be like.
yeah. Absolutely, and we'll end on this note, which is that as much as Sharif al-Murtada is a subject of historical investigation, 5th century Baghdad, so on and so forth, with the Hijra, but his style of writing, professionalism, of what we call professionalism today, scholarly intellectual professionalism, is is a human lesson in general, right? For how to engage with difference and navigate that without someone being required to renounce what they believe, while understanding and appreciating the intellectual journey of the people around them, right?
Def- Definitely.
And it's something that requires nuance, wisdom, helm, forbearance, and thank you so much. This
Thank you.
conversation has been so amazing. I mean, really, I think we can have so many more conversations like this, Dr. Abdulsater. We appreciate you coming on our channel today, for the podcast, and for all those that listened thus far. Visit our website or our YouTube channel for more content. And if you enjoyed this conversation, consider contributing to the Shia Research Institute to help drive more quality content in the future. Thank you very much.